Hello and welcome to Everything End of Life with me, Jason Cottrell, and guest, and of course the lovely Debbie. Hello, Debbie.
Hello.
So my guest for this particular session is going to be Clare Montagu from Poppy's. It's Poppy's Funeral Care, based in South London. And what we concentrate here is really fascinating because it's about care, okay, and the different levels of care. And Clare comes from, funnily enough, a background of hospice work, which gives her a completely different spin on funeral care. She's the CEO. So we're not going to say too much about that, but you listened to the interview, didn't you?
I did. I think the thing about funerals is it's one of those things that when something like that happens to you, and like when we lost my dad, I was like, okay, so what do we do next? How do we know? How do we know who to phone? You know?
I mean, and when my mum went 20 odd years ago, as I said, we had brilliant funeral care.
They were good. They were really good.
It's not always the case. Funeral care is a business, and you're going to get good and bad. But with Clare, she explains the whole kind of industry really, and really succinctly. So without any further ado, let's just listen to Clare. Hello, Clare Montagu, and thank you for joining me here at Everything End of Life. Now, for the world who doesn't know you work at Poppy's Funeral Care. Is it Funeral Care or Poppy's Funerals?
Well, we are the business name is technically Poppy's Funerals, but we call ourselves Poppy's.
Poppy's, yeah, which is a very friendly and open approach, I think. So that's something we'll actually come across. We'll talk about a little later. But would you be kind enough just to tell us a little bit about yourself, how you've ended up at Poppy's? Poppy's is in Lambeth?
So we cover the whole of Greater London. We have two branches at the moment, one in Tooting in Lambeth Cemetery and one in East Sheen in southwest London. But we look after people actually in Greater London and beyond.
Okay. So your position is presently?
I am CEO. I have been CEO of Poppy's for just over 2 years, which is a huge privilege.
Now, that's an interesting thing. Now, that's not something that you leave school and think, right, okay, I'm going to go head towards being the CEO of a funeral company.
No.
So how did you get from there to here, if I may ask?
Of course. So my previous job before working at Poppy's was I was working at a hospice for 7 years. I'm not a clinician. I worked in operational management in a large hospice in London. And so I saw at firsthand what amazing care people give, what the clinicians at the hospice gave at the end of life. And also how difficult and challenging it was for people who had a life-limiting condition to think and talk about often the end of life and end of life care, and to talk about it with their families. And so very quickly within hospice, we bumped up, just as you know, the experience of people not wanting to think or talk about death. While actually part of the hospice's job was to help people.
Yeah, we have a thing here called My Care Choices. And I'm sure you've got something or had something similar there, whereas you go in and you have to broach those subjects that are very quite difficult for some at that time, because it's a stressful time.
It is.
But yeah, so that's the job of the hospice. And interestingly, that's an environment which is very caring and very has a lot of not regulation, shall we say, but obligation, I would say,
and regulation.
And regulation, but to the client, to the person, to the family, there's a huge amount of emphasis on care.
Yes.
And
for me, so I was at this hospice where absolutely care and putting both the person who was sick, but also the family and friends around them at the heart of what they do is very much part of the ethos, along with sort of planning for the inevitable end of life and what happens afterwards. And at that hospice, it was Royal Trinity Hospice in Clapham, we worked closely with, and I knew of, Poppies, Poppy Mardle set up Poppy's funerals about 12 years ago. And she set up the business in part in response to some really shocking exposés of poor care and practice in the funeral sector, many of which, sadly, some of those practices go on today. So we were set up because Poppy wanted to change her career and do something a bit different, but the animus for our work was that the sector was often very opaque, very old-fashioned, did not focus on necessarily great care for the client, either the living or the dead. And as I say, she had seen a number of really quite shocking exposés about the way that some funeral directors were caring for the dead. And I think that motivated her to set up something that was different, that was about putting the client, both the living and the dead, at the heart of the business. And so for me, when I was at the hospice and then coming onto Poppies, what Poppies as a business does, as a funeral business, is absolutely a continuum of what the hospice does. So we put care for the living and the dead at the heart of what we do. And we don't sit there and try and flog you packages or tell you that, you have to buy a certain number of limos or that you have to mourn people in a certain way. We start with what matters to you, what is important to you, and how you want to remember the person who's died. And we take it from there. And so that sense of giving someone an outstanding experience and putting grieving people and dead people at the heart of the experience is all that Poppies is about. And that's very much a continuum of how hospices care for people at the end of life.
Right. Okay. Now, the very fact that you're mentioning that tells me that is not the case always, generally, shall we say, and that funeral care, a lot of people don't realise, is actually a business. It's a profit-making business, which of course then leads to some bad practices, some malpractices, which is what we presume, or I presume that Poppy had seen and hadn't wanted to have
for sure
people. So she wanted to make a big change. So then this is something, obviously, that attracted you from the hospice. Because when we talked before, you said that, you'd finished at the hospice, there was a bit of a gap. And you had a sabbatical?
Well, I had some time off. It was supposed to be a sabbatical, but it was during the pandemic. And so my planned time off turned out to be some time off at home.
It's fairly bad timing, I must say, yeah. But I presume that kind of then gave you some reflection and a desire to do something new.
So I think there's two parts. There's one thing I just want to pick up when you talked about the funeral sector, and we can talk a bit more about the standards in the funeral sector, and that being related to the fact that they're profit-making businesses. So for sure, the funeral sector is for profit. It's not a state-provided service. But so too is the social care sector. So too are many private hospitals.
Yeah.
The other issue here that people are always really surprised about, and I certainly was coming from a highly regulated sector, is that there is no regulation at all of the funeral sector. You could put some refrigeration in your back garden and call yourself a funeral director. There is nothing stopping you doing that. There's clearly some standards around health and safety and around infection control and public health, but actually there is no framework or license or statutory code in place for the provision of funeral services.
That is going to be remarkable to a lot of people. A lot of us just presume that this is some reasonably heavily regulated, very well organised clockwork thing that's going to happen when somebody dies. And to be fair, my experience, I was very lucky. The funeral care we had for my mother was perfect. Couldn't have been better. Had a really caring, lovely lady who came along with her guys and sat me down and talked everything through and gave me all the choices and made everything. It was a beautiful experience. I've got no complaints there. So I'm kind of hoping that most people have that experience, but that's clearly not the case for everybody.
No, I don't think it is the case is the answer. And I think that there are a number of sort of strands that contribute to this. So we are a death-phobic society. We don't really think or talk much about death. We don't know much about funerals until we're in the position that we have to organise one. Generally, it's something you do maybe once or twice in your life. And it's not something that, I mean, quite often, all the time, we get people ringing us saying, what do I do now? My mum's died. What do I do? And so you're in a position where you're very vulnerable, and you're doing this probably for the first time, unless you're very unlucky in your 40s, 50s, maybe 60s. And so you're trying to organise something in a sector that you don't know your way around. Whereas, most other environments, you've got an expectation that you know what that looks like, whether that's within a public service environment like a healthcare or a school. You know what what a good school looks like, and you know what a good care home looks like.
We have an Ofsted thing, don't we?
You have Ofsted, so you have ratings. Yeah, so you have ratings, but you also know, I mean, again, if you're shopping around in a commercial environment, you know what a good shop looks like, or a good retailer looks like, or what kind of department stores you want to shop at, what supermarkets you want to shop at. And so there's this sort of knowledge vacuum around funerals, and also there isn't anything in place that could give you a degree of consumer confidence. And so and because it's not a sector that is hugely thought about or talked about, there have been over time a bunch of practices that have emerged, some of us, and clearly not all funeral directors, but there are some where the practices is not great, and some of it is really shocking, and some of it is not really shocking. It's just routinely just not very nice sometimes, and not necessarily how you would want, your own mum or dad to be looked after.
I think that the interesting thing here is that we, as you said, we're death phobic. If we're not death phobic, it's not something we tend to look at until it directly affects us. And I think that is a very interesting thing, isn't it? Because it leaves a big gap in vulnerability, as you say. So we only tend to get to look at this when it's happening to us. So that in that moment, we're already vulnerable.
Yeah.
And then we go and look for somebody to look after us and to look after our relative who has died, or our friend who has died. But we're coming from a position that's very, as I say, vulnerable. Yeah. So it must be open to not crooks, but it must be open to abuse, bending of the rules, or
that's at its very worst. But I mean, I'll give you an example. So we do a lot of work talking to people about what we call great death care, what that looks like, and when you're in the position of needing a funeral director, what you should look like, and what you should look for, and what are the things that actually make good care after someone's died. Because again, without any either consumer standards or understanding of the sector, how do I know what I want for my person? I had a friend whose mum died during the pandemic, and he was told that because of COVID, she needed to be embalmed. I mean, that was nonsense. People are quite often routinely told that particularly if they want to come and visit their person after they've died, that they should be embalmed. And there's no reason for that. And it is also that what will classically happen is that won't necessarily be explained to the client what embalming actually entails. And embalming
threw me a real curve there, because I can. So embalming. So what is that all about? Because if you don't embalm,
embalming is a preserving technique, and it involves basically quite a lot of quite toxic chemicals, and it's quite invasive. And you don't need to, if you keep someone cool in refrigeration, you don't need to embalm someone. The only circumstances under which someone would need to be embalmed is repatriation, either if you're taking someone overseas or bringing them back if they've died overseas. If they're going on an aeroplane, they need to be embalmed. But other than that, they really don't. But actually, for some funeral directors, because of the way, particularly that they choose to operate their mortuary systems and the way that they have centralised mortuaries and local shops, and people if you have a client who says, I want to visit my mum or my dad or whoever it is at the local shop, and the person is being taken from a centralised mortuary to the shop, and therefore they're out of refrigeration for a bit, the funeral director feels more comfortable with recommending that person is embalmed. But the problem is that's not. If you don't know, you don't think to ask. And if you're just told, well, we recommend that you embalm, you go, oh, okay, then. And subsequently, you need to find out exactly what that means and whether that's right for you. And of course, there is also a cost to that. But just so that's a very live example that happens very frequently. If you go into a funeral director and they will say, well, if you want to visit, we recommend you should be embalmed. And you think, well, okay, you're the expert. That's why I'm here.
Yeah.
And of course, they're not the expert. They're not the expert. It should be the client who's the expert. It should be the client who's able to make an informed choice that says, and you don't think to ask, just like you don't think to ask when the dentist says, you're probably going to need a filling, or when the doctor says, I think you need to go for more checks. And the funeral director is in a similar position for many people, but without the same actually level of expertise that dentists and doctors have.
I think this is the interesting thing, is it? Because now is the time to unpick this for yourself, rather than when somebody dies or somebody close to you dies. And you're quite, it is quite enlightening to think, well, hang on, embalming, I never really gave that any thought to anything, and therefore I would have been taken completely by surprise if somebody suggested that. It brings me on to, I'm going to bring up the recent case of the funeral care that happened in Hull, and the police were involved, and 2 people were arrested, and bodies had to be taken to a place of safety. I mean, how bad must it be if even your body has to be going to a place of safety? So, and I think there were 35 bodies that had been taken from one particular place. So this is probably one of the worst by the sounds of things. But it does, show this complete lack of A, regulation, and B, openness about things. And it's the openness, I think, is another thing that when we were talking before, you were saying that Poppy wanted to make sure there was a complete transparency. So that your entire funeral home is kind of visitable for everybody.
For sure. I think that's absolutely right. So we take the view very strongly, in terms of our approach to care, is that everything is open, everything is transparent, and how we care for the dead is open and transparent. And that includes our mortuary. And that means that anyone who wants to come and look at our mortuary, see where their person is going to be looked after, if we collected someone and the family members want to come back to the mortuary and help check their person into the mortuary, that's totally fine. We also open up our mortuary for open days to our community and to people who are interested and want to find out more about death and dying. And we think it's really important that you talk about this thing that is shrouded in mystery, which is, how do you look after the dead? And people have imaginations that are way worse than anything in reality, and fiction and TV movies don't help. And so actually the part of our work is to say, this is what we do when we look after someone who's died. This is how we look after people in the mortuary. This is what we think great care looks like. And I think the whole thing, I've no idea what went on then. Nothing has been released, but it's just desperately sad for those families and friends who are now constantly thinking about and will not get respite in some of those cases, particularly where cremation has taken place, about what went on for that person, for their person. And I think there's always going to be, sadly, really bad practice, but there's both I think there's the point about regulation, putting in place some minimum standards that can then be enforced. But the bigger picture for us is that minimum standards only get you so far. When I was at Royal Trinity Hospice, we got an outstanding from the CQC. That wasn't because we stuck to CQC's rating systems. It was because we gave outstanding care. If you try and just deliver to the minimum standards, you only get minimum standards. If you want outstanding care, that needs to be at the heart of your philosophy. And that's true for schools, that's true for hospices and hospitals, and it's also true for funeral directors too. So minimum standards is a floor below which you cannot fall, but actually outstanding care comes from the philosophy of care that you have towards looking after people who've died. And it's also about being transparent and open about that care and saying, come into our mortuary. Our mortuary is a beautiful space. It's a sort of sunny, full of a converted chapel, full of natural light, wood panelled. It's unlike any other mortuary that you'll have seen. And it's certainly unlike any of the sort of basement, dimly lit, not very nice smelling places that you either see on TV or might imagine from TV. And we want to say we give our best space to the dead because that's emblematic of how we care for the dead. And everyone in this business does some work in the mortuary. I was in there earlier this week. I'm doing it again tomorrow. It's a great privilege to look after people who've died, just as it is a great privilege to do the work that you do in the hospice. And if we don't see that as being analogous to how we care for the living, then we're on a hiding to nothing. Once you get to the point at which you've got some minimum standards, you also need to be really open and think about what great care for the dead looks like. And that's the only way you get the transformation, just exactly the same as in education or in healthcare.
I think there's an interesting word you used there, and that's continuity. And, it would be nice to think. I mean, I'm going to ask you in a minute about how you see that could be improved. I mean, what government regulation could be put in place? I mean, it's going to be, an uphill struggle, I should imagine, because no MP is going to want to get that involved, I shouldn't think, with something that's not going to be a priority for him. I mean, it's not a vote winner, is it? So it might be difficult to see change happen within the industry. But the word continuity you brought up there, and it would make sense. I mean, it probably not financial or charitable sense, I'm not sure, but for that journey, when we start talking about my care choices, about what we want to see happen when we die, is for funeral homes to be much more linked to hospices. So that it's one journey all the way through. Almost, I mean, I know you can franchise certain things. I know various big funeral companies are franchised, but you can franchise. And if a hospice had franchised something, they would actually have some more control, you would think, about that journey from beginning to end.
I mean, I think there's a number of things to say about that. So we try and work very closely with not just hospices, actually, because people, as you know, not that many people relatively die in hospices relative to being at home in the community, in a care home, hospitals. One of the things that we do is try and work closely with local healthcare professionals to help them understand that there is such a thing as great death care. So I think at the moment, you're right in the sense that I think we do provide exactly the same continuity of care. I think the difficulty is that healthcare professionals, wholly understandably, are not trained to think about, and this was true when I was in the hospice, we're not trained to think about what happens after someone dies. I mean, when I was at Trinity, we looked after someone beautifully until they died. We looked after them beautifully after they died, if they died in the wards. And then at that point, the family was responsible for calling the funeral director, and then the funeral director would collect that person. And there was no sense for us, at least, or there's no sense for a lot of hospices, hospitals, care homes, that you need to concern yourself about what happens next, not least because, particularly in healthcare at the moment, you're absolutely overwhelmed with the care of the living. So what we try and do is say I think the idea of an extension is wonderful, but probably at the moment, a bit of a step too far for many sort of healthcare leaders with narrow bandwidth. What we want to get them to do is to think about that actually there is such a thing as great death care, and just to help people start thinking about that continuum. Not that they become experts in it, because I don't think that's too much to ask, but just that they know enough to be able to signpost the people that they're working with who are asking questions about what happens after death, so that they're able to say, we produce some information, we have a guide to great death care, we produce other information that helps people understand that whatever you're looking for, this is what great care should look like. And so we do a lot of work with healthcare professionals to say, just know that it's a thing, that there is good and bad care after death, just as there is good and bad care after life. And these are some things that you might need to know in order to signpost when you're looking after people at the end of life.
It's interesting. We have a thing at the moment. I think it's called compassionate cultures or compassionate cities, something similar. I think I've got it. Compassionate communities. There you go.
Yep.
And that is something that is people looking at the whole picture from birth to death and beyond, and trying to make that journey an easier and more well-educated one. I think what you said with having worked in a hospice and outside of a hospice, mainly outside of a hospice, that when we get to that point where the patient dies, it's almost a feeling of job done. We're finished. That's where our bit finishes, and then the funeral care takes over. And there's a kind of weird tiny little gap in between of the relatives being a bit kind of lost.
Yeah,
from, they've had all of this, compassion and this almost love and comfort given to them by the nurses and the doctors and the cleaners and everybody in the hospice, and then that just kind of stops. And then there's the funeral care.
Yeah. And that's the point that we make. Is that you don't want people to go off a cliff at precisely that point when they're at the most fun. And particularly then, with hospices, if you're also giving that family or friends' bereavement support, you've got a lot of intensive support, then there's death, and then there's an 8 to 12 week gap, and then we'll pop back up again. Actually, there's that bit in the middle, and we help families through that bit. And so again, that is the point to say that that period of time, that ritual, that start of that grief journey, for want of a better term, is really important. And you should choose wisely and carefully and understand, what's right for you as well. I mean, the other thing is that not all families and not all people are the same. So what one family or one friend or one person who's organising a funeral for someone wants is completely different from someone else. And you need to know that there isn't one way of doing a funeral. There isn't, some people will, for example, some people it's really important and it's so special to be involved in the washing, the dressing, perhaps putting makeup on the person who's died. For others, I can think of members of my family who'll be like, no, I don't really want anything like that at all. And oh, no, thank you very much. That person's died. So I think you've got to be able to know that the funeral director that can look after whoever comes through the door in whatever shape they're in and can help them and walk alongside them for the 3 to 4 weeks until the funeral, and that that they're going to give a great job with whatever client is in front of them. For some people, it's a big fuss. For some people, it's really low key. For some people, it's it's a very traumatic death, and that brings a whole load of other stuff that comes with it. Sometimes it's an old lady who's lived to 96, and while it's very sad that she's gone, it's a life well lived, and there's everything in between. We see every single bit of human experience, as do you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And we're going to come to the end of the interview in a few moments, but for many of us, the only time we ever have either experienced funeral is by watching Dave Allen on the television, or by actually being directly involved in something that's a bit more serious. Now, one of the things that's become very apparent to me is the huge breadth of experience and skills that you should really have to be a funeral director, from all of those things, from looking after how somebody looks like, how they're cared for, from the side of things. That's a huge undertaking. So I guess what I would, the thing that's on my mind most is the question I want to ask you is, how would you like to see it better regulated? How can that actually happen going forward? Nothing's going to happen this year. It's not going to happen in the short term. But what cultural change would you like to be able to see? Unless you know something I don't.
So I think you're right. So I think there are two parts to your question, and I think cultural change is the one that's critical. So there's the stuff which is not small, which is the regulation piece. And actually that's about a confluence of wills. There is work going on in Scotland to license funeral directors. The Law Commission is looking at not funeral directors specifically, but around the laws around burial and cremation and some of the new technologies that are coming through in that area. So there is sort of work afoot. So and there are new ways of managing the body after death. There's a process called alkaline hydrolysis, which is a form of cremation which the Co-op have said that they want to use in this country. So there are sort of hooks that are coming up. It does take political will, and whether it's a new or an old administration, it's not top of anyone's priority list. And sadly, one of the things we've learned, even with the whole case, is that there've been any number of exposés and sort of things don't change. But there are moves afoot, and definitely where, given that there is some regulation going ahead in Scotland, there is hope that there is something that could be built upon there. But I think. Yeah, but it is obviously subject to whoever's in government and the legislative programme and who wants to go down that road. But I think at some point that will happen. But for me, the bigger point is this cultural change and getting to a stage where we are curious about death, where we think and talk about death, where we plan for our funerals and our death and our end of life well in advance of, it's really hard, as you know from your hospice work, for someone who is really sick. Some people are all over it, but if you're really sick and death is imminent, like months or weeks, it is very hard it's much harder to be able to start talking dispassionately about what you might or might not want than it is when you're well and where intellectually it's going to happen, but it doesn't feel like it is imminent. And the more that we get comfortable with thinking and talking about death, that it is matter of fact, that it's something where we don't use euphemism, where we do feel like it's something that we're educated in, so that when it happens to someone who's close to us, we don't feel like that in addition to the grief, we're plunged into this vortex of, I have no idea what I'm doing. That's the only thing I think really is going to change. And I do think that there is a younger generation that is more in tune with mental health, that is more curious about some elements of spiritualism. I think that there are green shoots of a generational shift, and certainly people who obviously with technological change are much more up for looking at problems in a new way. So I think there is hope, but it's going to need a cultural change.
I've got my friend Greg Cooper from St. Thing, this compassionate communities, by creating events that raise that sort of awareness. We've even got and he promotes things that other people are doing. We have open days at crematoriums, for instance, and what can happen there. But it's very difficult. And as you say, we've got a whole new generation of people coming through who are a bit more aware. Because if somebody had said to me when I was 18 to 30, 35, would you like to come to an open day at a crematorium? I would have just scratched my chin and said, no, I'm all right, really. Thanks. I've got other things going on. Because clearly at that time I was immortal. And that whole side of death hadn't really touched me, apart from in my work. So it has to, I think there is a personal connection when it hits you personally. And lots of people from kids upwards have been hit by death personally with their relatives. So it's not just an age thing, I think, but it's a connection thing, isn't it?
And I think that's right. And I also think, I mean, you're right, like loads of crematoria do open days and those are great, but they probably, a bit like our mortuary open day, you presuppose a level of curiousness even to say that that's something that you want to do. Actually, there's a step back, which is even just stimulating the discussion. One of the things I always find, and I don't know if you find the same, is that I'm always so heartened by when I talk about our work. You know, normally that sort of thing where people say, what do you do? And I say, I work at a funeral directors, and ooh, God, you know, Grim Reaper alert. And actually, when I talk about our work and I talk about how we look after people and I talk around the issues around death and dying, people are genuinely very interested, even if they will themselves acknowledge that they haven't done their will or they haven't talked to their partner about what they want or any of those other things. It is something that I think we do have innately in us, genuine curiosity, because it is innate to the human condition. And so there is something that can be tapped at. It's just a case of finding the ways, I think, in which you are exposed quite young to making it normal that you talk about death. And it works in other cultures, and 150 years ago, it was very normal in our community. It's just the way in which things have developed most people haven't seen someone dead, for example.
Family now, don't we? We don't have that extended thing where it's happening, because of numbers of people. You're not taken to Uncle, Fred's funeral, etc. Because
not in this country, no.
There are 30 different Uncle Freds lurking around. So that interest. I think one of the ends, and it's something that I want to talk to with some friends of mine that are comedians, is how they can get that message out there, because that's the one thing. If you start off, certainly for us British white people, is humor, and it's a little bit of black humor, and then that is the way in to start the discussion, funnily enough, with people. And it's something I would love to see a lot more of us using comedy, just as we use theatre for revolution, is to use comedy for change and for discussion in these areas. So that's something I think that we can do. And certainly something I'll be inviting guests on to talk about, in the near future, I can hope. Yes. Anyway, listen, Clare, it's been amazing.
Thank you, Jason. It's lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, and you. And I'll have to come down to Lambeth sometime, have a cup of tea. And
that would be lovely. You'd be very welcome. We would do you a tour. We'd show you our mortuary. We're very proud of it. We'd love to show you around.
I'd love that. I'd be taking photos and
that would be,
I'm not, Yeah,
it's all right.
It's of course,
Yeah, it's okay.
So once again, listen, thank you very much for your time. And if anybody from the Greater London area wants to get hold of you, how do they do that?
So the best way is they can give us a call. We are 020-3589-4726. Or we have a website, which is poppiesfunerals, all one word, .co.uk. And one of the things that we do is we put loads of information up on our website. We have a blog that we call Talking Death, which is easily navigable from our website. And it has all sorts of resources and information, practical advice about what to do when someone dies, but also information about what's possible, And we are, I think Google's top search if you want to find out about embalming. We have a blog which explains what embalming is and why you don't need to embalm. So if you put embalming into Google, it will probably pop up with a Poppy's blog. But more seriously, go onto our website and have a look around. There's loads of useful information there.
That's absolutely fantastic. Right. Well, thank you very much. And I think that's where we'll leave it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Well, what an amazing interview that was. And a real eye-opener. I mean, refrigeration in the garden and you can set up a business. That's just shocking, isn't it? It's a bit of a worry.
That's terrifying.
It is.
It shocks me that there's absolutely zero regulation in that space. There's so much regulation in this country about so many other aspects. And yet one of the most important points of disposing of your loved ones, there's nothing.
No. And Claire just, she speaks so eloquently about the whole thing and so passionately. I think that's, absolutely amazing.
Yeah, that passion definitely shines through. Definitely got that.
Okay, so thank you, Claire. One of the things I want to bring up right now is the fact that there's a great and amazing book out there called The Last Kiss, Not a Romance. Hopefully you can buy that from Redline Books or Wivenhoe Books in Colchester, or Wivenhoe for the Wivenhoe Books. That would be more sensible, wouldn't it? It is available on Amazon, but preferably support your local bookshop is what we would always encourage. Our next interviews are going to be the now I've got to get this right, Bowditch Trust. And it is Richard and Nikki, who I went to chat with the other day, and they are amazing, incredible people. And they raise money to help kids, basically, between 18 and 25, who face cancer or life-limiting illnesses, but they don't do it what they're doing is filling the gap that the NHS should be providing, essentially. But they're incredible people, and I'm definitely going to be nominating them for the Colchester Compassionate Award, I think, for this year. But don't tell them that, okay? All right. So thanks very much, Claire, and we look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thanks. Bye now.